Welcome to Design Notes. I'm Liam Spradlin, and this time I had a chat with Steve Selzer, experienced design manager at Airbnb. Originally, I met Steve at MCE in Warsaw, where he gave a talk on designing friction into products intentionally, an idea that sounds counterintuitive at first, but one that highlights the importance of reflection and self-actualization in every experience. In this episode, we covered the importance of humanity-centered design, how designers can think of themselves and their products as part of a user's life, and how to avoid a dystopian on-demand future. Let's get started. All right, hey Steve, welcome to Design Notes.
Hi Liam, thanks for having me.
So just to start off, like I always do, who are you and what do you work on and how did you get there?
So I'm a design manager at Airbnb. I've been here for 1 year, and previous to Airbnb, I was a creative director at Frog Design here in San Francisco. How did I get into design is maybe a bigger story, but it wasn't a sort of direct path. I started out as an engineer, sort of electrical engineering, and moved into nonprofit work and saw some really interesting human problems out in the world, and eventually made my way to design and human-computer interaction and sort of service design and the digital world. So, found my way into consulting, which was a great way to sort of apply those skills more broadly across a broad range of problems. And like I said, transitioned last year to really focus on a problem I really care about, or an opportunity, I think, for us, which is to really sort of, transform the travel experiences, get people to travel more, and get people to travel better. Yeah.
Cool. So I know that I met you in Warsaw when I was there for Mobile Central Europe, and you gave a talk there that was really awesome, that was about designing friction into products intentionally. And it like really stuck with me, and I tried to tell a lot of people about it since then. But whenever I say that, like say, oh yeah, I heard this cool talk about designing friction into products, everyone's like, what do you mean? Like what could that possibly mean? So I guess just to introduce the topic, I want to get kind of like your super short version. Like what are the basics first of that like ideology?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the basics really are that first, that sounds counterintuitive, right? The idea of adding friction back in seems like it's counterproductive. Things are already so difficult, to use. Our lives are so full of challenges, and things aren't easy. So why would we want to create that? Why would we want to make it any more difficult than it already is? And so I always clarify that what I'm talking about is not making things unusable. Not trying to make them, sort of in software terms, not adding unnecessary steps or trying to make things harder unintentionally or without some reason why. And the reasons that drive me to sort of look for opportunities to design friction back in are that I think that friction can help us, reflect on our own values, and through understanding our own selves, discover new things, and eventually grow as people, as individuals. I think at an individual scale, that's really important, but I think increasingly this is a really important issue if we think at the macro scale of the kind of change that technology is enabling in the context of things like the on-demand economy, automation, virtual reality, and and not to say I'm doom and gloom, right? That it's all going to be bad, but I think that if we're going to intentionally design that future, I think we need to understand what we care about. I think we're but I think that technology can often get in the way of that, and it can be really compelling, it can be really really desirable, and often as opposed to sort of deal with the path that leads to that self-reflection, that self-discovery, we'll choose the easier path, the one that technology allows us to, sort of just go on with our lives, easy, convenient, frictionless. So in light of that, I've been thinking a lot about how you bring, how do we bring that into design intentionally, and that's what I wanted to share in that talk.
And so these effects, it seems like the frictionless experience where things are, I guess, is so easy that they occlude like self-discovery or reflection, or the processes where you do introduce friction and people get that extra benefit, like both of those are invisible, right? So I guess I'm just thinking about like how the user experiences that.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I mean, I think we can feel friction. We can feel it when it's like, why is this so difficult to use, right? Like, just do the thing that I want you to do, right? That's feeling the friction and then expressing that frustration, right? It's not acting the way it should. It's not making my life easier. Um, if we're really nuanced and subtle about it, though, um, it can just feel like, oh yeah, of course it has to do that. That's of course the next step in this process. But if we're really good about that step, inserting it into what is otherwise a really easy thing to do, we can often deal with problems ahead of time. We can cut them off. And one example of that, of course, with like Airbnb is just, how can we ask this question a lot, but how can we help people set the right expectation going into the experience? And um, if we made it completely frictionless, so easy that you never had to reach out to your host, you never had to really, you know, um, read through some of the house rules that they want you to observe, or you know, interact with some of the other things that we kind of surface on a listing page. If we made it so easy, you might show up and be met with a reality that doesn't right meet those expectations that you made up, because we left too much space for you to kind of imagine what that might be. And so we have to kind of find the right mechanisms and the right levers, the right moments to introduce what might seem like friction. But if we've done it well, then it just seems like the natural flow of things. But what we're doing is we're introducing a little bit of friction that allows you to set the right expectation, that allows you to begin to, create a relationship with your host, and sort of accelerate that process of connection and belonging.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know if this is on the same kind of track, but just the fact that through Airbnb you do meet another person who's like local to the place, like that might be anxiety inducing for some people. but but it's it's not an anxiety that's associated directly with the product, I guess. It's just something that you experience, but then you still get the payoff of like having this person who knows the area and like introduces you to the community and stuff, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, at best, we're more than just an accommodation, right? I mean, you could still travel to this amazing home in this amazing place and step outside and be completely lost alone, and your travel could look like what tourism at its worst looks like, and just sort of mass produced, disconnected from what locals do, what the lives are like there, and what the culture is, and then you just get caught, and it's easy, right? It's an easy trap to fall into, but you get caught just taking pictures of all the sites. You're not really present for these moments, and there's not a real connection. I mean, I think the people who feel that the most would be the solo traveler, right? Connection is really important for those people. That's not to say you can't travel alone and have a really an amazing experience. And for many people, right, solo travel can lead to that transformation, that sort of personal growth. Um, but I imagine, right, in many of those cases, it's often because they've connected with people along the way. And as you kind of move down, cascade down into different kinds of travelers, when you have people who travel as couples or travel as groups, the need isn't as acute there, right? You kind of have your dynamics in place amongst the people you're traveling with. And so you could still have a great experience, but it can still be that sort of isolated, experienced amongst yourselves. And so I think it's really, it's actually a perspective. It's a mindset that, travel does at its best, right? Enable that sort of self-discovery and growth, but it also happens through the connections that you make, the people you meet,
Right.
and the experiences you have with others.
And I again, I don't know if I'm on the right track with this either, but it seems like Airbnb is kind of like enabling that mindset for even for like people who aren't seeking it out. Is that true? Because I know like before I used Airbnb for the first time, that was like so not even a thought in my mind, but it ended up being the case.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think you're right. And that experience is probably what a lot of people experience their first time using an Airbnb. And I think yeah, I mean, part of it is that, you know, um, it's a more it's a deeper latent need to feel that sense of connection and belonging wherever you go. Um, if we tried to sell that to you directly, it might come off as, a little bit too, swirly or just intangible, or feeling like it's not the kind of vibe that I'm going for. I'm not here to buy that, right? What I do want is a nice home that I can stay in. And so that's really you know, um, that's our path in. We get you into a home, and that home has a person there. Um, the person is your first chance, right, to connect with the local and connect with the neighborhood, and maybe some of their friends, and go to some of their places with them. But a lot of people also don't travel that way. So I think increasingly when we look at the experience of travel, right, we look at the home, of course, but we are thinking about and trying to help people connect outside of the home as well, because that's a big part of realizing that mission, to belong anywhere. The belonging is the thing that happens when people connect, when people feel that sense of connection in the neighborhood or the community that they're sort of dropping into.
Right. And I think you also mentioned in the talk, maybe not such foundational feelings as needing to be connected to a place, but also just interfaces in general and how people feel accomplished when they feel like they're adept at using something, even if it's relatively not that hard, but there's still some challenge. So um, I guess playing off of that a little bit, another session that I went to that was really fascinating was a man who used to work on YouTube at the UX there, and he mentioned that they experimented with inserting suboptimal search results into the search page and found that it actually sped up people's decision making. Like they found a video to watch faster, which led to them watching more videos. So does that kind of play into this? This like it seems like kind of an invisible friction that's maybe like a branch off of this. What do you think about something like that?
Yeah, and I mean, I understand where they're coming from, and it's probably that they're outcome driven, right? They want, and I don't mean to sort of deflate what they are able to do by inserting that bit of that interesting nuanced friction. But I'll talk about more about that in a second. But just to kind of call out, I think the kind of where the logic begins for a case like that. It seems like, from my perspective, that it's so much of their business model is surfacing advertisement, right? So they need to have lots of eyes on lots of videos, so they have more opportunities to surface ads. And the faster they can get somebody to decide and watch more, the faster they can show you those ads. And again, I think, like, so if you work backwards from the outcome, then you start to experiment with mechanisms that might drive a behavior that gets you that outcome. We do the same thing, right? And that's in experimentation. What we're looking at is an outcome, all of the mechanisms that we know that might get us there, and ultimately we experiment and we see how things move the needle, and eventually we roll those things out to 100%, and that becomes your experience. I think where that specific example is interesting to me, and and maybe this is a value judgment on that, but I guess I guess I'm curious what they felt the problem was from a human sort of experience perspective. If you
Right.
remove the issue of I need more eyes on more videos so I can show you more ads, what is the consequence of, or maybe the benefit of showing you things that you might not like, to get you to the thing that you do ultimately choose? Um, and I think where that falls is in one camp of behavior change, which is, it's referred to as behavioral economics, right? It sort of uses extrinsic motivators or nudges from the outside, um, to get you to do some kind of behavior, often referred to as like the carrot and the stick, right? Um, in this case, it's by showing you options that you obviously wouldn't like, it's nudging you toward the option that you will like. But in some ways, right, and I think we have to kind of watch out for these things. Like when technology can do that, then we're riding this really interesting line where the word manipulation, in the best case, is sort of, well, we're doing it because it's good for your behavior, right? In healthcare, they talk about behavioral economics as a good thing. It helps people stop smoking. It helps people eat healthier, right? Um, in the case of something like this, it's interesting because they're applying sort of these mechanisms to get you to choose a video faster. And you might be completely fulfilled by the video that you watch, but you are in some ways being manipulated by the UI. And design is all manipulation. Design is all about putting things there for you to have a particular experience. Where I would kind of come back to, and sort of the topic that I have with this idea of friction, there's another idea in here which is a responsibility to be human centered when we design. And I've started to even go as far as to reframe it as humanity centered, because human centered still suggests the individual. I'm thinking about you as a human, not as a user, but humanity centered, I think, takes the macro view. Because if we're eroding away sort of at that scale, all of the people who are using YouTube, the millions of people watching YouTube, are all being affected by this. We're starting to affect people and their behaviors, their values, the things that they expect technology to do for them. We're starting to do that at a mass scale. And I think with that comes a different sort of set of responsibilities. Um, so that said, I look to another body of work around intrinsic motivation. So what can we do to help people understand themselves better so that they can make decisions faster? Such as, like in that case, it's not that I don't, it's not that I need other things that I don't want to identify the thing that I do want, but rather help me, or maybe in this case, you could argue that it does to some extent do that, um, right? By learning like these are the things that I don't like, and these are the things that I do. Help me make those decisions faster. Help me recognize what I care about faster. And so, yeah, I guess um, an experiment like that um, could potentially be framed as a positive in the positive light. It's driving intrinsic motivation and self-understanding and awareness.
Right.
Um,
So there's kind of a line between help me understand what I do and do not like versus kind of imprinting a like versus dislike on me as someone who doesn't recognize that already. Right.
yeah, yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Now, why would you do that, right? I mean, I think that's kind of outcome driven versus maybe values driven,
Right.
right? Um, and that, I guess maybe that kind of raises the question about how we do what we do in product organizations, right? And a lot of products are outcome driven, right? The business needs to grow. We need to get more users. For us, yeah, we want to get people back traveling on our platform, and we'll do a lot to enable that. Um, and in many cases, it's removing the friction. Um, and so again, I go back to kind of the first thing I said, which is that, yeah, I think this idea is a little bit counterintuitive. Like, why would you ever do that? It's not in service of your
Right.
business. It's not in service of, the user experience to make it, to add friction, unless you frame that as a value, right? That friction is an important piece of like the human experience. That anything worth doing requires some effort. Um, And it was interesting. I did this talk once before. I did it at South by Southwest, a similar talk, and a really big audience. And one particular guy, asked this question of sort of asked, like you know, why do we even why do we need to go through all this effort? And the example he was using was getting in shape, right? He's like, if I could just sit on the couch and connect me to some things, but like basically if I don't have to do anything to get in shape, like why wouldn't I choose that versus the path which is to have to like work out and like
Right.
take all that time to get all that effort to get there. And my question back to him was, well, what would you do if you were in shape? Like, let's say you magically were in shape. Now, what would you do with that? And
Right.
then he was like, well, then I'd go and like I'd do all these things. And I was like, well, why wouldn't you do those in the first place?
Yeah. And I guess it's also kind of like, how would you feel about being in shape once you got there if it was just like a machine that did it, right? Like what would that mean to you?
There's that, but it seems like, and based on his question, he was more comfortable with that, right? He's like, that is fine with me. Let the machine, make me fit. But I thought it was interesting to say that because then, but the result of what, okay, so now I'm in shape, I'm fit. Now I get to go do all these things that I want to do. And the interesting thing for me was you can do all of those things you want to do right now, but you feel like you have to be in shape to do them. And that's where there's like a really interesting thing that's happening. That, like, again, we are so used to or becoming more and more accustomed to technology enabling, right, our lives, making it more convenient and easier, that we're looking to things like that, where even the logic breaks down, right? The logic of that kind of doesn't make sense to me that you get in shape to now go and do things, but you won't do them now, which will eventually get you in shape. Like there's no joy in the activity. There's only I need the end result. And I think that that's what a lot of technology promises us, right? It's not about the process. It's not about the effort. It's about the end result. And technology can do that really well. It can take care of things really quickly, efficiently, invisibly, and and we can shoot that laser at every aspect of our life, right? We can turn it around and point it at ourselves and be like, make me fit. Um, and I think we're getting there with, a lot in the healthcare space, not wellness, but, wellness is trying to change behavior through, kind of product engagement and physical fitness. But we're looking at ways to shortcut that in the healthcare industry through pharmaceutical, solutions, through new procedural ways of doing that. And so it's really interesting because I guess it's coming, and we'll all have this opportunity to take uphill and lose weight without the consequences of previous diets. Um, and So I don't know. I guess this is a values. This is a discussion of values, right? Like how much
Right.
do we value the process over the end result? What is the end result
And
worth if there was no work to get there? Um,
yeah. And I guess people's answer to that question might change over time. Like I'm wondering if there's a craze for get me there as soon as possible. I don't care how, but it will actually come back, and people will be like, well, now that I have all these things, like I kind of don't care about those anymore. Like, what's next? And we'll come back to a point where we appreciate the process.
yeah, I think there's two things in what you just said, or at least what I like. There's two ideas in that. One is that, yeah, I think, um, you know, at risk of sounding like a Luddite, right? Like, these things are coming, and we need to decide how we want to, embrace them or what we do with them. But I'm actually in the camp where I think that like we should lean into this, right? We
Mm-hmm.
should, like, if I can be fit overnight, and that's an option, I think I would still choose that. And I think what it does then do is it then moves the conversation forward to say, now that I have that, well, where's the next, like, what is the next thing? the next
Right.
challenge. Um, the other piece of it, though, I think is well. So I mean, I guess that's just to say that there's always going to be motion. We're always going to be moving forward. We're always going to be making progress. But there's inflection points, right? If you look at kind of like the Industrial Revolution, it was a response to sort of, it was capability that allowed us to mass produce products. Um, as a result of, kind of, we lived in a world where everything was handmade, unique. It was slow. It cost a lot. We were able to mass produce it, mass distribute it. It enabled a lot. Then you have another inflection point back toward, you know, the slow foods movement,
Hmm.
the artisanal chocolates and the handcrafted goods. And it's a values shift, right? As soon as we have one thing and we're almost reaching saturation, inevitably the need is for something unfulfilled. And what is unfulfilled is that thing that's kind of the inflection point back. And so I always use the example of Wall-E or like these sort of dystopian futures, just to say, like, I don't think that we will get there. I think that we'll inflect back and forth between moments when we go crazy around, on-demand economy, but then eventually we go, you know what, actually, I want to make my own meal again. Um,
Right.
you know, or, I'm driving around in cars all the time. I'm going to walk to work today. And I think that inevitably, because our needs fluctuate. I think we will always see kind of these inflection points. Um, but it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, the future is uncertain. The only thing that I can see, and I think it'll be interesting, is that the rate of change is accelerating. And what I reflect on is, okay, if we're human, physiological beings, our bodies, it takes a long time for us to adapt physically to situations, right? Until there's that magic pill where I'm fit overnight. Emotionally, it takes us time to get over things, right? And think of things like grief. I mean, that takes a long time for some, right? Um, these are slow processes. Technology, on the other hand, really fast, really quickly, can change our lives, but we don't have the same timelines that we once did to reflect on that and to become comfortable with it or to not be comfortable with it. Before you know it, right, you've got on demand economy, you've got it automated, you've got virtual reality, and you're almost disincentivized to not participate in that. And all of a sudden, we're like, wait, what happened, right? And escaping that, well, right, hopefully isn't this sort of dystopian world where it's like we have to get out of this. This is the wrong future. Um, I think that with design and human-centered design, people thinking about this will always kind of be that values judgment, right? Like, well, actually, we need to address the needs here. We're over inflecting in this direction. How do we bring it back?
Right. And I guess going back to what you said about, being a product organization and everything, back to kind of like outcome driven decisions, you can have both. It sounds like, human centered design is thankfully becoming more popular. Like it's something more people are talking about these days, uh, which is cool because you can be driven by outcomes, but still have that focus on, actual human qualities and helping people on a personal level. Um, Not sure if that was a question, but it's a thought. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and can you apply that lens to other products that you use,
Right.
right? Like point out the things that are driving you toward what that company probably, and this is deconstructing it, right? But what are they trying to do to get you, right? To do what they want, right? As a behavior, right? A customer behavior. They
Yeah.
want you to complete a transaction, or they want you to click on more things, or spend more time viewing videos, whatever that might be. But is there a nuance there that's taking care, right? Is paying attention to maybe something else? It's trying to help you in some way know yourself through this experience. I mean,
Right.
I think that can be something that you as an individual bring to any product experience you have. Um, but I also think that products, organizations like like Airbnb and any other company that's got this footprint and has this this impact in the world, we also have responsibility, yeah, to make sure that you know we're doing things that are good for people at an individual level, kind of maintaining that that human dignity, as well as kind of thinking at the macro view. How are we impacting humanity at scale by introducing these things? And
Right.
you know, all companies are going to have their challenges. I think Airbnb particularly has challenges that are very human, very nuanced because of the nature of what we're dealing with. We're inserting people into new environments where, change is change, and that which is different are very real in our world. Um, and I think other products that are safer environments where I'm on my device or I'm in my safety of my home have other responsibilities. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting space to be in because of the unique challenges.
Yeah, and I guess I'm also just thinking like beyond responsibility, maybe it turns out that actually caring about humans is a good business decision too. Like maybe that actually improves your outcomes, rather than just being about the outcomes themselves.
Yeah, I mean, on the outside, it may not seem like it, but and I think there's a lot of critics out there about Airbnb, but I think what you do see on the inside are people who are incredibly passionate about that mission. Um, Now, how we realize the mission is an important distinction from having this aspiration, right? Just because we say that we want this is, that's one thing. But yeah, I think we care a lot about that as an organization. We care a lot about it at the individual level, and and people are incredibly passionate about these very challenging problems that we've always dealt with. Humans have dealt with these issues throughout history. We have inherited some of those same challenges um, because the nature of our product isn't purely a technology play. It's technology that facilitates connection at best. Um, but it can also facilitate a lot of things that aren't as great. And those are the challenges, right, of our business. So on the one hand, yes, I agree. It's good for business to be so consumed by these these human issues. On the other hand, it puts us in a really difficult position a lot of the time um, because these problems haven't been solved by others in many
Right.
cases, and yet we're responsible for doing our part. And yeah, and I think that comes with the territory.
Yeah, which makes it sound both terrifying and thrilling at the same time.
I think that's I think that's like the healthy blend. For any problem you go after, it's got to be a little bit terrifying,
Yeah.
but also really, hopefully more proportionally fulfilling.
Yeah. If it's not a little terrifying, maybe you don't understand the problem yet.
That's right. Yeah, you haven't dug deep enough because it's there. Yeah.
Yeah. Sticking on human-centered design though, I also started reading a post that you made on Medium, about how human-centered design requires more than just empathy for other humans, like kind of a one-way, like I guess, uh, this is not from your post or anything, but like kind of an observer empathy. Um, and this is something that I think about a lot too as a designer. I always say like I'm not the user, and I hesitate to even call myself a user, but I know that I'm in there somewhere. So, how do you think that we as designers can kind of think of ourselves and find our place in relationship to the product and other users or users in general?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really where a lot of the other work around designing friction back in where it really started. Um, I think the way that the way I would frame it is, you know, um, we talk about designing for other people, um, and in order to do that, we need to understand their needs, their desires, their values, and if we could be completely objective in the way that we understood those, translated those needs and desires into a product experience, that would be maybe realizing that goal, right? Of we've designed for you, and we've been completely objective about it. But I think that that's a little bit flawed, and I think it's okay that it's flawed, but we just need to recognize it because we are human translators. And actually, our ability to empathize, right, um, is also the reason why we aren't reliable at being purely objective. We're emotional. Um, but I think that emotion allows us to uncover insight. So, where do we fit into this piece? Well, I think we come with an unconscious implicit bias, and we just need to understand that and recognize that. We have to know that we are always, to some extent, designing for ourselves, even when we're designing for others. How can we minimize that? Well, in some cases, we probably really, really, really need to minimize that because we're getting in the way of truly understanding the needs of others. And that's where I think, to the extent we can, we need to uncover those unconscious biases and ask ourselves, where are my values, right, coming through, whereas I should be representing the values of others. On the other hand, we are often the user as well, and those are situations where I think it actually makes a lot of sense um, to empathize with yourself and to listen to your own intuition there and hone that. That is a skill to know that from your experience with this product, or service or whatever it may be, you can uncover all of the moments where it's difficult or it's uncomfortable or just unnecessarily, challenging, and use that empathy that you have or that ability just to know what a better experience might be, um, and leverage your own experience to make that better. Um, when I talk about human-centered design, though, right, I think one of the tenets of human-centered design is that we're designing for others and that we have to go uncover their needs. And so that's where I just want to be clear and a little bit critical of those who say that they do human-centered design, um, but often are really just maybe more, sort of user-centered. I think we have to zoom out and we have to understand the implications of our product in the context of all products that are influencing this person. How are we adding to or contributing to something that might be, you know, um, might be manipulating a person or might be eroding away their own what values they hold. And so I think our responsibility is also then, right, to help them again come back to an understanding of their own selves.
So would you say, I'm interested in this distinction between human-centered and user-centered design. Would you say that user-centered is more uh, on the side of the spectrum, I guess, if we're going back to a previous part of the conversation of like outcomes and just your specific product then, rather than taking into account other products and I guess the world at large?
Yeah, I mean, this is a semantic issue and probably splitting hairs, but yeah, I think it's important. I think it's an important distinction. I mean, user centered means that the person who uses my product can use it well and can do the things that I want them to do, right? And yeah, there's amazing designers out there who make amazing products that, um, yeah, and I'm guilty of using many of them, right? Like I love these, some of these products, but yeah, I mean, I think where the human word, like that word, kind of comes with a little bit more responsibility, and that's where I think that it's about zooming out, right? It's about looking at the trend. It's about looking at kind of more macro implications, and that's where it becomes really nuanced, though, right? Because it's hard to measure. Well, it's hard enough to measure sometimes, what your own, your own product is doing in terms of kind of the consequences of the things you've done, like in your products. Yeah, okay, well, just staying there and measuring that would be enough. Um, and then to say, wait, but we have to now zoom out and see what kind of the cumulative consequences are of all of these companies doing all of these things. That's absurd. That's not our responsibility. But that's where I would argue, no, I actually think that if we're truly being human centered, or again, maybe we need to say humanity centered, um, I think it is our responsibility to ask that question. Like, what are the consequences of all of these things? Because we're making deliberate decisions to contribute to that or to shape behaviors toward those ends, or not, right? And I think um, if I were to put on my business hat and strategic hat for a moment, I'd argue actually that companies who can understand that when there are macro trends that move in one direction, and are very strong, really compelling vectors, um, that if you can get in there and understand that, that the opposite will very soon be the desired thing, if you can get ahead of that and start to fulfill this sort of counterintuitive need, I think you can often find that will open up a new market, right? Um, and I saw this a lot in consulting, right? You see clients coming in asking to sort of join the vector. They want to be a part of that wave. But if you can show them that actually that wave, while it's strong, is already fulfilling these needs, but people are now starting to sort of unconsciously feel something new. And we need to go find that and tap into it and create a new vector. And you need to be the first. You need to be ahead of that curve. Um, I think startups are the ones that do that, right? They disrupt because they come in and they identify this thing that's completely counterintuitive. But now I'm essentially just talking about innovation. But kind of coming back to our responsibility there, I actually think that we have a responsibility to constantly innovate, again, if only to counterbalance these strong vectors, create the inflection point so that we have this nice flow through the future, as opposed to any one strong vector kind of dominating us and kind of creating that dystopian future that nobody wants.
And it seems that even taking the human-centered approach, kind of regardless of whether you're going against the vector or with it, creates kind of like another facet of the experience that improves it overall, even if it's something that's not visible or a feeling that the user doesn't immediately associate with the product, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think that's it, right? Like I think that's why design is so interesting, because
Yeah.
we're talking about invisible, um, well, often invisible forces, and often because those invisible forces are the human sort of forces that drive us, that govern us, that are invisible to so many. Um, One of the I really enjoyed this podcast, Invisibilia, because it talked about a lot of that. Things that are invisible to us. One really big, important thing that's invisible to us are expectations. Our expectations of ourselves, our expectations of others. So much is driven by this invisible force. Um, and again, I think technology is influencing that. It's driving our expectations higher and higher with regard to how technology, should remove friction from our lives. It's doing so much of that that we're becoming sort of less resilient and less, less patient and less tolerant. And I think that one of the skills that we all need, especially given how much technology can change our lives so quickly, is an ability to navigate change, right? An ability to reset our expectations to something more reasonable, and have a mindset that goes into an experience with, with sort of a more open perspective to allow things to happen to us. Because if we don't do those things, then when any service or product breaks down, right? It's that's ridiculous. How could it do that, right? It's letting
Yeah.
this is absurd. How is this product breaking down right now? And it's like, well, are we that reliant on these things, and do we expect technology to do that much for us that we can't even handle some of these situations? Um, but again, I think this discussion has probably been, we've probably heard this over and over, generation after generation. Why I'm particularly interested in talking about it is because, yeah, I think we're hitting an inflection point with technology. I think it's happening, moving faster and faster, and we will feel that curve, sort of the elbow in this sort of the asymptotic like curve. We'll feel it when things like we always talk about AI, right, and the singularity being that moment when life will be unrecognizable to ourselves. But it's hard to even imagine what life was like before the iPhone. Um, it's hard to imagine what life was like before the internet. You know, And but those are like there's a major chunks of, there's like a decade or 2 decades for each of those things. Now we're like, I can't imagine life without Uber, right? And
Right.
Uber's only been around for a couple of years. When we get to a point when it's like I couldn't imagine life without, and it was something that got introduced to us yesterday, um, you know, that's a very interesting place to be. Um, I'm ready to ride that wave. But as a designer, I think, I have a responsibility to shape that future to some extent as well.
Yeah, and I guess just recognizing uh, these kind of invisible factors that are at play in everyone's lives, including our own, uh, that we don't associate with technology or products or anything else. We just recognize that we're kind of feeling this way at a time and account for that, basically. But yeah, to your point, anytime that AWS goes down, it's like a news item for the rest of the day. So it's interesting. But yeah, I have, believe it or not, come out of this conversation feeling more optimistic about the future. I don't think we're going to spiral out into Wally after all. So yeah, it's been great to have you on.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, thanks, Liam. It's always great to chat about this because, this is a philosophical conversation. And while I've done a lot of the talking, and thank you again for like allowing me to sort of, share these philosophical musings, I think it's important that everyone, sort of asks themselves, right? What do you care about? What do you value? And what is the future as it should be? I think those are questions that we should all be asking ourselves, and then I think we should all be having the conversation.
Yeah. And not just designers, too.
And yeah, not just designers, yeah.
Because we've all kind of got a stake in it, right?
We do.